Good afternoon to all of our viewers. I'm Hans Bruyninckx. I'm the Executive Director of the European Environment Agency located in Copenhagen, and welcome to one of these COVID-19 environment and climate debates, which we are organizing together with our partners in the European Information and Observation Network for the Environment, and also the EPA Network, which brings together the environmental protection agencies in Europe. The goal of this series of dialogues and debates is to consider a number of the elements that are being hotly discussed when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, in when it relates to environmental issues, our relationship to natural capital, climate issues, growing out of this recovery, the European Green Dealing, all of those elements. And today we are focusing on our relationship with nature and on planetary boundaries. And I am joined today by two excellent speakers. The first is Ester Asin Martinez, who is the director of the European Policy Office of WWF. Ester is somebody who has been active in advocacy leadership for care development, but also for the last 2 years working for WWF. Welcome to the dialogue, Ester. And we're also benefiting from the expert knowledge of Professor Carsten Rahbek. Carsten is Danish. He's an ecologist focusing on biodiversity and macroecology at the University of Copenhagen, but also at Imperial College and Peking University. And he was one of the midwives, if I might say so, of the IPBES. So he's operating at a global level as well. So welcome to the two of you. To briefly frame what we will be doing, I will give a short introduction to the topic, then I hand it over to the panelists. If you are listening online, you can ask your questions in the Q&A part of the site here, but you can also go to our Facebook page, the EEA Facebook page, and voice your questions, and we will come to them later. Okay, so first short introduction. Well, it is by now, I think, well known that the corona pandemic is often linked to notions of, I would say, our disturbed relationship to nature. And people sometimes refer to the zoonotic origins of the disease, that it jumped from species to species. We know that this was especially in the first weeks of the pandemic, a thing that referred to the markets in China, for example. And it's not the first time that this happens. We've had AIDS, we had SARS, we had Ebola, and so on. Some people referred to our agricultural methods, yeah, and they referred to other diseases that we've seen amongst animals, the meat industry, like the swine flu or other diseases. But some in general also talk about the degradation of ecosystems in general. And in that sense, it is linked to notions of planetary boundaries, or for those who do not like that framing, you could say the carrying capacity of ecosystems when it comes to how we use them as humans, or even more simply put, the way in which we deplete, destroy, pollute, and overuse our natural capital. Yeah. So let's have a discussion on how this all hangs together and how it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're doing it, and then I'll stop my introduction and hand it over to Ester. We're doing it at a very good moment in Europe because this is Green Week as well, where nature and biodiversity and ecosystems are central. As an agency, we just published our State of Nature report, also the MAS project, measuring and assessing ecosystems and their services, was launched today. The biodiversity information system for Europe is relaunched in a modern and improved look. So this is a good moment to address these issues. But now first, Ester, can you give us your introductory words on the topic?
Yes, and thank you very much, Hans and the EAA for organizing this series of debates so needed. I think you frame it well in your introduction when you said that the health crisis has really put a magnifying glass on the interconnections between human health and the health of our planets and how the two are linked. And they've also shown how fragile our global and national systems are. And as you said, today, the EU institutions, businesses, NGOs, the financial institutions are discussing how we recover from COVID, what recovery. And I think one thing that I would like to say is one of the lessons of the past crisis, especially the 2008 and 9 financial crisis, show us that any recovery guided only by narrow economic indicators can lead to increased inequalities, but more environmental damage as well. So that's why in WWF, we are now calling to the EU to shift to this concept of a well-being economy to successfully recover from COVID. And we are using an existing framework, the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework to achieve a just, a socially inclusive and a green recovery. And central to this approach is how we measure success in our societies. And it's also the idea that the economic success is not only measured by GDP or by productivity or gains, but it's also measured in terms of the well-being and the health of the citizens while protecting the planet resources for this and the future generations. So this idea of planet boundaries as well. So it values and puts at the center of the political decisions and the budget decision what matters to people, basically. And this is health, education, but also nature and the communities. The second point that I wanted to make is nature also has to be part of these recovery plans, because we know that the damage, again, the links between the outbreak of the pandemic and the deterioration of ecosystems. But we know that the damage to ecosystems, including forest or grasslands or coral reefs, could drain nearly 10 trillion US dollars from the global economy from now up to 2050. And this is according to one of the reports, Global Futures, that we published a few weeks ago. So instead of a trade-off always between economy and nature, I think we've realized that the interdependence of economic well-being and nature can actually present a great opportunity. So nature-based solutions exist, and there's a wide range that can help to address the crisis, both the nature and the climate crisis, and at the same time creating jobs and prosperity. So whether we talk about restoring forests or building green infrastructure, protecting mangroves, practicing agroecology or planting urban forests, all these practical and implementable nature-based solutions can be deployed to, as I said before, on one hand, protect and enhance nature, and at the same time creating, sustaining or enhancing decent jobs. And my last point in the introduction is what other policies? I mean, other policies, and you briefly touch on that, need to shift. Of course, I think your annual report puts also a spot on, for instance, on intensive agriculture as being one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss in Europe. So we know that we can stabilize and reverse the loss of nature by, of course, embracing more, bolder and ambitious conservation efforts, but that's not going to be enough. We need also to make transformational changes, especially in the way we produce and consume food. So making food production and trade more efficient, reducing waste, and also favoring healthier and more sustainable diets. And of course, reforming our current agriculture systems. My last point is also that what we are seeing is how demand for food products leads to the externalization of our footprint across the world. So what it means that we are using land outside Europe, especially outside our borders, to satisfy our consumption needs here. And this is coming at a terrible cost to the environment and to people, especially through deforestation or land grabbing and speculation. So what we are also calling is on demand side governments to develop and enforce policies and legislation to eliminate deforestation and conversion from the supply chain and create consistent markets for sustainable source commodities. And at the same time, working with the supply side governments to support them in this transition. And we have now a great potential in the European Union for such legislation, because the European Commission has just opened a public consultation on this matter. And I'm very happy to see that we are seeing a lot of level of mobilization from citizens. We launched a campaign together with other 100 NGOs, and we have already 250 people signing up for this legislation, which shows as well that I think people
Ester,
do care about nature. That's my last point.
Great. We will come to European policies later, but first now, Carsten, you are, of course, a hardcore ecologist. I know you are involved in a ton of field work, not only in Europe, but also across the globe. So could you shine some light on that disturbed relationship with nature and the links that we see with the pandemic?
Yes, I will try. So thank you for the invitation. I have some slides to underline my 3 points.
Great.
And my first point is that we have what we call the emerging, neglected, and novel diseases. So we're seeing a lot of new diseases like HIV, Ebola, various varieties of avian influenza, SARS, MERS, COVID-19. And about 15, 20 years ago, we had worldwide major research programs to look at whether it was just an effect of the world being smaller in terms of news that we had all these diseases, or whether there were actually an increase in the number of diseases going from animals in the wild to humans. And the fact is that there is an increase. That also causes that there's an increase in for risk of pandemics, and that also causes, if there's an increase, what's the primary cause of it? And if we're looking at the increase, this is a recent paper we published on diseases related to bats.
Carsten, if I may, you said you had slides, but we don't see them.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sure they look fantastic, but we don't see them. So if you could share the screen.
Yes, sorry. Is that better?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Please continue.
Yes, sorry. So this is a recent paper we published on the transfer of diseases from bats, and it's basically looking at the years between outbreaks. And what we see on the y-axis is that we are going from intervals of 40 years down to intervals of 5 to 10 years. And we're gonna see a risk of transmission that could end up in pandemics. So there's a lot of reason for why we have a high risk of pandemics. What I'm interested in is why are we seeing this transfer that could potentially cause pandemics. And for 15 years, there's been scientific consensus on, now it won't change my slide there. And the most of the scientific consensus is that it's related to the biodiversity crisis. So we have loss of habitats, we have deterioration of ecosystem functions, we have 70% of land surface is degraded, 20% of world species are threatened. We see a tremendous decrease in the number of individuals on Earth. So basically we are disturbing Earth. In the system, so what we see in the system is that we are getting closer to nature, but we're also disturbing ecosystems, and organisms, including viruses and bacteria, need to deal with changes in the world, and they need to reorganize themselves in the ecosystems. And that brings me to the second point, and that is that and I think this is a crucial point, that humans and our livestock are biological organisms. We are part of planet Earth. So when we're disturbing this, we are part of the ecosystems and the networks of interaction with also diseases and bacteria. And we kind of been living through that. We live on one planet and we can do whatever we will with Earth and it has no consequences for us. So, but we are a biological organisms. And so why do we have this increased spread? Well, as Ester said, we are disturbing nature. We have 60% of all tropical deforestation is caused by our demand for food. But what is more interesting is that if you look at the 6,500 wild species of mammals, they only constitute 4% of biomass of living organisms, whereas our livestock constitute of 60% and humans 36%. If you are a virus or disease in a disturbed system, you're playing a lottery game with mutation. And if you play the bingo game here and where you're going to end up trying to survive in a new world, well, the 96% is probably where you're going to end up. And if you're a virus, what you really like is plentiful resources that is predictable from year to year. So we are a wonderful place to land in a virus. It's not because they have a strategic plan, but this is a result of us mixing everything up. That's why we'll see a lot of new diseases traveling to humans. But we also have a link to how we make productions. For birds, there's a lot of other viruses coming from birds. We have 70% are chickens. A couple of years ago, we published a special issue in Science where we mapped out the genomic of the major lineage of birds. One thing we showed was that the immune defense of birds disappeared 100 million years ago. It got reestablished, but there's one species, there's few species where it did not get reestablished. One of them is red jonquilfowl. Every poultry we have in the world come from red jonquilfowl. It has no immune system. So what it does is that it grows quick and lay a lot of egg. That's what we like. But right now we are surrounding ourselves with poultry that have no immune system. This brings into that our food system is very homogenized and it's very fragile. So we're under a huge risk here. So we need to think about and bring diversity also into our food production. And that brings me to the last point, and that is that there's going to be an economic aftermath of the corona pandemic. And right now we're discussing whether we can afford, in the light of all the cost, to deal with climate change and the biodiversity crisis. And they have this linked. And what we publish several papers on is that, put bluntly, we simply cannot afford not to deal with the cost. It is so expensive to run ambulance service and to do monitoring and then deal with it. We can just see what it costs now. So we need to look at the cost and lower the risk in the future for future pandemics. And this is my last slide, just illustrating that. And here we are with the cities, and we basically saying, be sure to wash our hands and all will be well. And then we might be a little bit concerned about the recession that's coming. But all of this is impacted by the global climate change and the biodiversity collapse. So if we don't deal with that, we will have waves and waves coming over us. So we need to deal with this. There is a wonderful book written by Paolo Giordano, and it's written a diary over the 6 first days when it spread in Italy. And he's reflecting upon what happens to his life and social things. But the entire book is that when it is over, we can be relieved, but we need to stop and think what caused it and deal with that, because we don't want to go through this again and again and again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carsten, for I think this very illuminating but also sobering input in the debate. Ester, would you like to piggyback on Carsten's explanation with the point of view that you also describe in a number of WWF reports, of course?
I would like to follow especially on the impact of agriculture, because we know that the global food production and consumption and one of the single largest human pressures on Earth. And I think agriculture already occupies, I think, 50% of the Earth's habitable land. And we are not also taking into account, for instance, how much greenhouse emissions come from agriculture as well. I think now it accounts for 25%, but it's set to increase. So definitely, agriculture is using and polluting a lot of the water resources as well. So this is one of the huge pressures. And now we need to realize how we change it. And what has been interesting during the pandemic, I think in many countries, I think there's been a realization by citizens about the importance of food, because, when we were in lockdown, people say, oh my God, what we are going to eat, and turning into much more local food production. I have friends working in local cooperatives here in Belgium who told me that the demand just raised, during the lockdown. And then maybe after people, went back to the kind of business as usual. But I think there's already really a wake-up call. But also, as I said before, on the impact of the food that we are consuming is having on other countries and in other ecosystems. And as you said also, Robert, I think something that we've been ignoring for too long, and we keep saying on our, the Living Planet report and others, is this is really a dual crisis, and the two feed into each other, the climate and biodiversity. When we lose nature, we can exacerbate the impacts of climate change, and climate change, destroys nature. And I think this is, if we make to put the two together, this is, clearly, this is where we have the game changer. Because if you see the level of mobilization and political commitment that we are having on climate, that's what we need to create now for biodiversity and nature loss.
Okay. I'd like to make a link to a debate or a framing that we see more and more also in policy debates, but also in science debates. It's the idea of one planet, one health. Sort of approach. And Carsten, you told me that you and a number of natural scientists were moved to the faculty of medicine at the University of Copenhagen. And I think that is an interesting notion. So could you tell me a little bit about how that relates to this concept of one planet, one health, and what the objectives are in the world of science to bring these two systemically interrelated parts together?
Yes. So, we are faced with a number of global challenges, and here we're focusing on health and on climate change and biodiversity, and they are interlinked. One of the big challenges we have in terms of research is how do we foster truly interdisciplinary excellence in research? And from my experience, I've been running centers that has lots of different disciplines. 25% of my professors are professors in economy, brought together with geologists and ecologists. Because if we are to make society decisions based on a scientific foundation, we need to look in it and in holistic ways. And what we've done in Copenhagen is that we generated a new institute called Globe Institute, and we moved 250 scientists from the science faculty into the health faculty. So we're getting closer to this. The health faculty is also being, traditionally health has been interested in how do we cure and how do we discover, but they're getting more and more interested in what causes it. And here there's a lot of links to the environment and global change. That's why we moved geologists, earth scientists, climatologists, biologists together. We could as well been at the science faculty, but the point is to bring this together to try to meet some of these challenges, because we can't solve them. The idea that we can solve the biodiversity over in one corner and the climate change to the other corner and human health just focusing on ourselves doesn't work. This is why I urge that actually this second point I have, humans are biological organisms. So I often see when I work with Campylobacter and Salmonella spread, and all linked to the wild nature. But the truth is, what we find is that the agent that spreads it are humans. We part of this. Now we have the mink case in Denmark, largest producer of minks for fur, and they say we can't understand why the disease is being spread because we don't transfer the minks, but people are transferring it. So there's a jump from nature to people. So also all this new direction in health, moving towards public health, trying to look at the socioeconomic aspects, it needs to go together. So that's why we moved and launched this new institute.
Okay.
And we're trying to learn each other's worlds.
That must be fascinating from a scientific perspective, and
challenging.
What is interesting in and of itself is that it's called the Faculty of Health.
Mm-hmm.
When I asked the question, I called it the traditional Faculty of Medicine. But if you make it a Faculty of Health, it has a very different notion to it.
And as our dean is saying, it's about the health of Earth. This is coming from the Faculty of Health or Medicine.
Yeah. Okay, but that sounds almost revolutionary. Now, Ester, if I can tag on to what I think you have been pleading for with a number of the other large NGOs in Brussels, that is to have indeed this more systemic approach to sustainability. You refer to the SDGs, which of course have a strong connection to the social dimension, to the health dimension very explicitly. How are you framing this as a group of NGOs? Because Carsten tells us that they're merging scientists of very different backgrounds. How are you from an NGO knowledge community trying to bring these things together to push policymakers in a certain direction of integration at a systemic level?
Very good question. And I have to say, a challenge to us as well as environmental NGOs, because as Carsten said, I think we've been working too often in silos, to be very honest, you know, and also within our own organizations. And I guess this is publicly broadcasted, you know, but we've been working on silos. I think now we've realized, as you were saying, Carsten, that we need to take into consideration the economic, the social, which includes the health and the environmental aspects, and how we really change the center of the decision maker to really put the value on what really matters and is going to prepare us for future pandemics. So this is, for instance, why it's not a concept that we produce, the well-being economy. And you know that there are others like Beyond GDP. Other organizations are even advocating for the degrowth. In WWF, we pick the well-being because this is the one that, in our view, allows to, you know, have social progress, to have prosperity within the planet boundaries. So, but other NGOs are taking others. And as I said, for us, it's a challenge because it implies that we need, well, basically, we need to understand where others are coming. We cannot confront anymore environment and poverty. The two are linked. We know that the ones that they are going to suffer most the impacts of climate change and biodiversity are the ones that they are vulnerable already today. Who's paying the pay of the crisis today, of the pandemics? You know, is the lower classes, you know, the less skilled workers. So for us, it's a challenge of break those silos and try to formulate what you said, policies that respond to these three pillars: the economic, the social, and the environmental. And I know that the SDGs these days, you know, might sound a bit old-fashioned, you know, SDGs, but actually, I think they are more relevant than ever because this is really the framework that we need. How we translate that into concrete policy making, I think that's the challenge. In the European Union institutions, we are seeing tiny steps for the time being, not big revolution, but I think maybe steps into the good direction. And the last comment that I would like to make, because many people also in the discussions around COVID are asking, but what about the European Green Deal? Is this still relevant, the European Green Deal? I would say yes. The narrative, it remains very relevant in tackling, you know, biodiversity, in tackling climate and many other things, energy as well. But there's a big bug in the European Green Deal, and it's what we call a Trojan horse. And in the first paragraph of the European Green Deal, you have that is a growth strategy for Europe. And as I said before, if we only think about only growth purely, we won't be out of the problems at all.
Okay, that is clear. Can I tag on to the biodiversity strategy? Because that is the big new initiative when it comes to biodiversity and ecosystems. And also the COP in Kunming, the COP for the CBD. To what extent do you have the feeling that they are addressing these complex linkages also with health and with well-being issues? Are they doing this enough? Are they connecting to this more societal dimension of biodiversity and ecosystems in a strong enough way? And Carsten, you have been one of the leading people in the IPBES analysis and report. So maybe you can shed some light on the scientific basis and how you see this landing in the preparations for the CBD, because there again, we fail on every indicator almost that we set for the current period.
So if we're looking at health and diseases, I would say that I start by saying that, you know, 15, 20 years ago, we reached scientific consensus on these things. And I've been giving, my primary is to work with biodiversity and ecosystem services and those kind of things. And I've been giving many big talks 10 years ago. And I always got asked, what is your greatest fear for the results for humans, for biodiversity? And I said, pandemics. And there's been lots of people saying that. Harvard Medical School has been out very forcefully. So there is an interaction between microbes and humans, and one of the saying in the scientific community is that there's always been an arm race between microbes and humans, and right now we are disturbing Earth, so there is a renegotiation between microbes and humans might be on the losing side. Even though, if you look at IPBES or CBD, this health issue and link to biodiversity has not been a significant part of it. It's not been. So we can't, but we are seeing now that UNEP and United Nations, and we also saw, if you saw the latest press release for the EU Commission on Biodiversity, they linked it into the COVID. So we can say that this pandemic we are in was perhaps a very urgent wake-up call that there is a link to public health here. And I'm seeing leaders around starting to address it, but we are lacking behind in the solution and the proposals of what to do to deal with it. So I have hope, but if we hadn't had this pandemic, I'm not sure it would be in there.
Okay, so if I can capture a couple of the interesting elements. First of all, this doesn't come as a surprise to the scientific community. So there is something about early warnings and about taking signals from scientists seriously, and maybe taking a sort of precautionary approach.
But Hans, I would say that I would add in that it's not a big surprise to those scientists working on that link. Yeah. But for biodiversity in general, I think many of my colleagues, it's a big surprise.
Yeah. Okay. So good. If I link it to the biodiversity strategy, which I think is innovative when it talks about restoration of nature as a key target, maybe we should also understand that as restoring our relationship with nature, and as part of nature in a fundamental way. So not just restoring bogs and forests and wetlands, but that fundamental relationship. Ester, I see you nodding, but before we go on with our discussion, we have an audience. So are there any questions at this moment, Gulchen or Constant, coming from our audience?
Yes, there are. I think that it's being a lively debate. So some of our social media followers have expressed a high level of interest from Albania, Vanilla, or Aisha, definitely saying that this is a topic, saying definitely it's a hot topic. We have a question about maybe the last point that you were discussing from Oliver, who says, really interesting figures and arguments, and he has a question: is the fact that we don't see our civilization within Earth and the planetary boundaries a sign that we are not ready to solve upcoming pandemics sustainably? And another question from Todd, if I can bundle them together. Professor Rahbek paints a scary picture. Is it too late to turn things around for nature and humankind? And also, what role should NGOs like WWF play in mobilizing awareness and public support for the serious changes that we as a society should make?
Okay, Esther, I would like to start with you, because you, of course, represent an organization and also a number of partners in a network of NGOs and knowledge NGOs, as I would call them, that have been pushing for this type of integration and solutions and mobilizing people. So what would your response be to the people asking this type of question?
A very, very good question. Well, I think, very honestly, I think we've lost touch of nature, to be very honest. I think we've taken nature for granted, We believe that, the forest in the Amazon and in other places, they will be able to absorb whatever shocks. The oceans will be always able to absorb all the CO2, all the acidification, that nature has, a never-ending capacity to regenerate. And I think this is because nature has become not close to our daily lives, to be very honest. We say in WWF that nature is more that, a nice screensaver, in your computer. I always say that in the debates, and Hans, is really the air that we breathe, but we've lost. I mean, we don't understand anymore that value. And I think this is why we are in such situation. It's been mentioned, but in the Living Planet report, there are 68% of the species that we've lost, mammals, birds, fishes, in less than 50 years, and 47. So you can imagine also why, you know, what the generations, my generation and the one who preceded, what they've done. And very often I think we say, well, you know, it's losing maybe, you know, some tigers, some elephants. No, it's losing entire ecosystems that depend, that they are our networks, you know, to survive on Earth. And so that then, what's the role in, for instance, bringing back nature into education, for instance? And I would really say formal education, because as I said, that's one of the networks that is sustaining us on Earth. And I think there's a role, the future generations are going to, I'm sorry to say that, I think they are going to face, they can face a very dear future. We've been talking, for instance, about climate projections. And now we are set maybe to raise global temperatures even to 3 degrees. So I think we can even imagine what it is. So I think they're the ones who will have also to take the action and live maybe with the lack of consequences. So there's really a role for education. I mean, to bring education, to bring nature back into education. Last point about the work that we do as many NGOs. Well, we play many roles, but it's clearly that more and more I'm seeing where I sit, you know, in the Brussels office of WWF, but talking to a lot of my colleagues in national capitals, I think people are more and more interested in taking action. They want to understand why we are in this situation, as Carsten explained, what we can do to mitigate and to solve it. They are really keen on understanding why, and they want to engage. And I've mentioned different campaigns that we've run, very policy campaigns, but showing that people do care. I mean, I always refer about the one on the Water Framework Directive. I mean, Water Framework Directive, what is this? More than 300,000 people in Europe, you know, sign up to protect this water legislation. So we NGOs, we have to give the tools to citizens. We have to empower them, you know, to really go and ask decision makers for action as well. So I see that very much in the years to come, much more work on mobilization, education, and awareness raising than ever before.
Okay, thanks for that link also with mobilizing citizens. But Carsten, I'm sure you have something to add there as well.
So I could also have talked about ecosystem services and raised the point that 30 to 50% of the gross national product that humans are consuming every year come for free from nature, and that is what we're disturbing. And so when I give my talks, I always insist having the journalist ask me whether it's too late or whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. And I am very sincerely, enormously optimistic. And I am that for different reasons. With IPBES, we brought together scientists to answer what is the scientific knowledge and foundation for the questions and challenges we're facing. And one of the positive results that comes out is that we know what the drivers are. We know very much about the solutions. There is almost no scientific disagreement on this. So there is a very permanent and solid foundations. When I go to COP meetings or sitting behind in a delegation as a scientific advisor, if they want to ask me questions, I am seeing countries, diplomatic corps being very knowledgeable, taking it very seriously. I'm seeing the same thing from the politicians in there. It's slightly different when they go out in public debate in their home country, but in there, they take it seriously. The challenge is, and this is what I've been told several times when I'm talking to EU Commission members, is that there is an understanding and there's a willingness to make the decision and changes. But there's one fundamental thing that needs to go with it, and that is the public need to be ready for it, and especially in democracies. And there is a huge discrepancy between the public understanding on the seriousness of these issues. But if we can tighten that, and that's also what Ester was kind of talking about, if we can close that gap, I think we have the politician and the knowledge to deal with this issue. And my last reason for being optimist is that I see a generation, the youth generation won't have it. It's their future, and I see I mean, Greta Thunberg has done it in the climate. I'm one of the experts that she's sometimes very annoyed with, and that's fine, but I also see it in the biodiversity. I see youth movement. They're different. They're not organizing NGOs. they are self-organizing, but I think I see politicians around, these are the future voters, and they're starting to pay more and more attention. Yeah. So I'm actually very optimistic.
Great, we like that. And during Green Week, as a little anecdote, maybe I was in a panel with a young woman who was, I think, student age, and she was actually a young beekeeper. And her fascination with pollinators and the role they play in ecosystems, and then, you know, the intense activity of being a beekeeper and that the connection it gives with nature was clearly inspiring her and a whole generation of young beekeepers across Europe to have a fundamental debate about our relationship to nature, to ecosystem services, the fundamental role in the food system, and then. So it's the type of people indeed that give me, given the color of my hair, also some optimism. If I can tag on to one element that you both made very strongly, that is that we need to stop seeing ourselves as outside of the environment and ecosystem and biodiversity. We are a species, yeah. Mm-hmm. But what shows this to me is that we have even developed terms that place us explicitly outside it, like what economists use, externality, yeah. And I understand in economic terms what it means, but the term strongly suggests that it's somewhere that is not part of us. Whereas, of course, yeah, it is part of the reality in which we live. Or the bumper sticker, throw it away, ? There is no away, because we are part of it. So I think indeed, even the framing of the debate is often fundamentally not pointing in the direction of us being part of that larger whole.
I like to challenge that. So I understand externalities. I mean, now I come from a center where 25% of my researchers are economists. Yeah. Yes, we can agree that it's an awful term. But what is happening is that a lot of, after the economic recession, a lot of economists start looking at different ways to look at the green economy that takes in ecosystem services. And there's a tremendous influence and interest in externalities and how that can be incorporated in forecasting economy also, and how we can get a balance. So the word is not very nice, but actually right now they're really focusing on bringing that into mainstream economy.
No, I fully agree with the fact that it has a meaning and it's used now to have fundamental debates. But the term in and of itself,
I agree with
signals for me something bizarre. And you know that there used to be this saying that if you believe that eternal growth on a finite planet is possible, you have to be an idiot or an economist. But by now the discipline has, of course, incorporated the fundamental planetary boundaries and limits in its discipline.
But here's another reason to be optimistic, and that is that if you look at how we use our resources on Earth, we're used to that resources are vast, and we can just use it forever. So we are enormously inefficient in using our resources. That means that within the resources we can actually have an enormous potential increase. So if I'm asked sometimes, do you believe that we have to go back to the Stone Age and be part of nature and all that? And is there space for economic growth? And I said, there's plenty of space for economic growth. If you're looking at the waste and the misuse and the inefficiency. So I'm often hearing, we don't have space to set aside things for nature and ecosystem. And I'll say, there's plenty of space on Earth. It's just that we're using it tremendously inefficient.
All right.
So it's not a matter of whether we can have growth or not growth. It's about being smarter and wiser in how we do it.
Which is the essence of the other panel, the International Resource Panel, amongst other things. Gulcin, do we have other questions?
Yes, we do. Actually, there are a couple of comments. So Oliver is thanking for the answers. Apparently, he's working on sustainability matters, raising awareness at UNESCO on sustainability matters. So he'll pass on the message. One of our Zoom participants, Andrea, was actually asking about the role of environmental education, which I believe Esther unknowingly has covered already. We have a question about the food system from Mario. Says, both Esther and Carsten mentioned the food system, and the global population is expected to increase in coming decades. Should we talk about population growth and how we can feed more people, I guess, within this kind of context? And Angela is asking, we seem to be circling around the issue, but not moving to solve it. We have all the solutions, so what is being done now, right now? And everybody agrees on the road, but is anybody taking it seriously? So I think it's about the speed of change, how fast it can happen, how it can happen.
Yeah. Okay, maybe on the food system, Esther, if you can go first on that one, because I know it's an important topic also for WWF.
Well, the speed on the decisions, well, that's, let's see, I'll try maybe to address some of the questions on more people on the planet and how and whether we can feed them. Well, we can, because we know that if we change the way we produce and consume food, especially in some countries, we reduce food waste, especially in the countries where we have, for instance, a higher intake of meat and dairy, we change, to more plant-based, type of solutions. We can feed the planet, but are we doing these changes quickly enough? Maybe not. In Europe, we have a big elephant, which has been the common agriculture policy, for instance, which was created at a time where, food security concerns in Europe were different than they are now 50 years ago. And now, it's been becoming, just their vested interests that want to keep the status quo. But this policy is exhausted. We really need to think about sustainable food systems, in the EU as well. So maybe in some areas, the change is not happening as quickly as we would like to see. But as Carsten, I'm optimistic because I still see change happening. And I always refer a lot maybe to climate, but again, if we hadn't had Fridays for Future, the climate marches, elections in many countries where people really ask to put that higher on the agenda, I mean, never in the history of the European Commission, the president of the Commission announced that the European Green Deal will be delivered within the first 100 days. And that was partly because of this pressure. So again, it comes to the role that we as citizens and organizations create these movements as well and put pressures on politicians to take actions. Now we can see some of these changes happening where? In the national recovery plans. We are going to have billions of public money transfer into economies. It's a great opportunity now to make changes, to massively scale up wind and solar, to think about another type of agriculture. We have to take those opportunities. They exist. So yes, I hope I've addressed some of the questions.
Yes, Carsten, you are of course coming from Denmark, the country that is the world capital in pig farming. In many ways. So I'm sure that as an ecologist, you've had many questions about food system and meat industry and other elements.
Yeah. So let me take another approach if we're focusing on diseases. I think that we have in the old system or the current system, we're focusing on maximizing the amount of food we're producing. But we are forgetting, we're often doing that by as I said, we have one species of chicken. It is the one that do not have immune defense. There is 20 sister taxa to that, and they have immune defense. If you look at pigs, yes, I come from Denmark that produce the most pigs per human. How do we do it? We feed them food with medicine as a precaution, right? So we've had for many years that we're feeding them penicillin. Or gee, they're now resistant to it, and now we have a bigger problem, right? So we need to rethink how we are treating our livestock, and we need to lower a little bit the profit per animal in order to make it more safe for not creating a system that is just, enormously receptive to pandemics and diseases. So we need to balance that into it, and it needs rethinking. And what I don't see in the EU commission's policies are being discussed is this topic. I don't see it. And this is coming back to, it's like we don't perceive humans and our livestock as biological populations and organisms. What we do know is that in population with lots of genetic variation, diseases has a harder time manifesting itself in those systems. And we are homogenizing all our production systems. Mm-hmm. We're creating a heaven for diseases.
Okay, now for the last 10 minutes of our dialogue, I'd like to frame it in a certain way. We know that there is a climate crisis. We're now told there is a biodiversity crisis. There is a social crisis of inequality. And now we've got a serious medical crisis or a health crisis on top of that. And you're telling me that there is a higher probability of that in the future. We see the cycles. So we've got more uncertainty. It's more risky. It's more unhealthy, maybe even more violent over time. All of these systemic sort of risks and uncertainties that are out there. From both of your perspectives, if you are speaking to citizens, and not only to your colleagues in the bubbles in which we all live in of some sort, but to citizens, how do you deal with this sort of framing that is out there, which they know about? And then linking that to your science, Carsten, you showed us these slides, and then sending the message that the responses that you see in society indeed are the origins of the hope that we should have. The message is, yes, we can scale this up and speed this up, but how do you deal with that in both of your roles as a top scientist and as one of the top people in Europe in advocacy around these topics? So risk, uncertainty, dangerous elements, crises, your science, and then the responses that you see. Carsten first, and then Ester.
That's a difficult question to answer.
Which is why I ask you, the top scientist.
I'm so happy to do it. I would, I think that as we talked about, it's about awareness. Awareness comes first before we can talk about the decisions. We have to realize that we need transformative decisions. We can't just do minor changes. So we need to get into that mindset. EPA will come up with a report with suggestions for transformative decisions, and we need to have an open mind about discussing those. The other thing is that we need to understand that there is a connection on this one Earth system between climate change, health, economic growth, and biodiversity, and a lot of the solutions are the same. So we need not to waste too much money saving climate change in one corner and the other corner. The other thing is that there will not be a wonder drug. There will not be a technology that solves it all. Of course, drugs and technology will help, but we need to start taking more serious. And I think Esther pointed at also that nature solutions we need to avoid tipping points, but nature solutions. Nature. One of the things that I'm interested in is what does it small populations, which is driven towards extinction. And one of the wonderful things I'm finding is that life is hard to kill. So some of these crises may not be as bad as we think. The other thing we're finding is that biological complexity has an enormously resilience. This is where, for example, if you look at a solution, to me, a first step is we need to deal with the food, but a solution is this proposal to set aside 30% for nature. It's good for climate, it's good for ecosystem services, and it's good for also preventing diseases. Let me just share a thing. Yeah, I'm a scientist, so I'm interested in things we don't know. So we go out and collect data. So if we go out and collect data in a disturbed ecosystem, we see a very high transmission of diseases from disturbed ecosystems to humans. If we go into a system with the same amount of disease in the system, but it's intact, there's very little transfer. That's an observation. and we get it repeated. We don't know why, but I think that biological complexity is part of the answer to this.
That is, I think, an extremely clear message on why we need to protect complex ecosystems, not only because we think they have value for their services, but also because they determine a relationship to ourselves in a very fundamental way. Ester, over to you.
That's a tough question. So, and also following after a scientist, I feel really, oh my God, what to say. What I said the other day in a panel is what it is about. I think it's been always about is really redefining our societies. We know we need to decarbonize our economies. We need to become more nature positive. And I think, as you said, the citizens need to be aware in order to make the choices. And at some level and some scale, they can do it. You know, they can decide whether they bike to go to work instead of taking, you know, the car, whether they can buy, you know, some bio products instead of, but they also need a framework that support them in making those choices. So, for instance, the recovery plans. Why we are going to build new airports or new roads instead of saying, let's electrify or let's deploy even more trains across Europe for people to travel. They also need this type of frameworks. And then what's the role of politicians in making the choices? I think politicians are very much aware. The thing is, they are not using science enough to base their policies. So hence, I think for me, it comes how much science informed is our actual policy making, I doubt. And the second point is that we have to involve more and more. Also, the business as usual of the democracy is proving their limits. We really need to rethink the way we do policies, because people will have to be part of the choice, will have to embrace the choice and have the ownership. So they have to be part of the decision making, you know. And we have some interesting experiences when we talk about, for instance, just transition, you know, in the regions that are highly dependent on coal. People need to be part of the decision making. That would be my
okay.
wrap up.
Thank you both. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you and listening to you, and I think our audience has the same impression of this is truly inspiring debate. I would like to end by saying that in many ways the planet is screaming at us. There is no more business as usual. Yeah, it's business as unusual now in its relationship to our society. So we need to adjust our policies and the choices that we make. There is no more business as usual there either. It's not about tweaking in the margins. It's not about perfecting what we know is not going to be a solution or making the non-solution more efficient. It's about making the necessary choices because we know that it's one planet, one health, healthy people, healthy societies based on healthy ecosystems. And in that sense, I think the priorities referring to the SDGs are that natural capital should be regarded as the foundation on which we build healthy societies, for which we need an enabling economy. And unfortunately, we still often turn that upside down, where we think that the economy is the center of everything and it can draw on the resources of society at a certain price. And it can draw on the resources of the natural systems at a very low or any price at all. And then we are surprised that we end up with the results that we're in. On a positive note, because I really appreciated that both of you were optimists and also brought reasons for optimism to the table. I think we are living probably on the continent, Europe, that has framed the most ambitious, most integrated, and most optimistic, forward-looking notion under the Green Deal. And I'm not naive. I'm not, believing that putting it on paper is going to make it happen. But the ambitions are there more than ever, and they are framed in economic and societal terms. They are inspired by science. They realize that this is not just a government proposal, but it is a societal transformation. I can only hope that indeed the ambitions for climate that are in there, for biodiversity, for health, for a different food system, for chemicals and pollution, that we can in the next years see the transition that is needed to bend a number of the trends and curves that we've seen over the last decades. And actually, one of the first words of the Green Deal is indeed transition. So the method, not only the objectives, even the method is part of the European Green Deal. Thanks to both of you. Thanks to our listeners.
Thank you.
It was a great pleasure. And we will be back for a next session of this series in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.